Hello. I'll start with an acknowledgement of country. Griffith University acknowledges the traditional custodians on the land in which we are meeting and pays respects to the elders past and present, and extends that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We'd also like to acknowledge all those who have a lived experience of suicide before we go forward into this event. If you want further details, we're going to be going quite quickly. We've got a great deal of material to cover, and if you want any more information, you can get in contact with us via Facebook, Griffith Health, Googling the information about AISRAP and through the web page. And if you need support, it's out there, and you may want to use some of these numbers. Now, I'd like to welcome you to today's event. It's a special event for us. We're celebrating 25 years of the School of Applied Psychology and AISRAP, the Australian Institute for Suicide Research and Prevention. 25 years of work. Ideally, well, first we wish this event to be in person, but the COVID restrictions have meant that we've made this into a virtual event, and it seems to be something which has really been a positive. We've got more than 600 people registered from all over Australia and our immediate region, New Zealand, Malaysia, Singapore, China, as well as Northern America, Europe and Africa. So we're very fortunate to have so many people with us. Thank you very much for coming. We have a number of dignitaries. I'm just going to be very quick and only mention four. I'd particularly like to thank Ivan Vukocevic, the Queensland Mental Health Commissioner, Terry Ryan, the State Coroner, John O'Gorman, Emeritus Professor, and Sue Spence, Emeritus Professor here at Griffith University. So what are we going to do? What is going to be the main focus of this event? Well, we're going to start off with Kari Colbays, who is currently an associate professor but becomes a full professor on the 1st of January. So it's also a kind of a wonderful kind of way for us to acknowledge that big change. And she's going to be talking about 25 years of research at AISRAP and the role of AISRAP in trying to prevent as many suicides as is possible. Then we'll move on to reflections of a previous director. This is Professor Diego De Leo, AO, who will give an overview and a reflection on 25 years of AISRAP. Next, Queensland Suicide Register, and Dr. Stuart Lesk will tell us about how it's made an impact and how we've been able to make changes based on information we've gathered from the register. After this, there'll be an example of how we've applied the philosophy. A problem well defined is a problem half solved, and so this will be a snapshot of Apprentice bullying and suicide by Dr. Vicky Ross as she teases out what is happening and how this high-risk population has been identified and how their needs are being identified to reduce suicide. Then we'll have an overview of suicide education with Jacinta Hallgood and Ingrid Azols, talking about education and how it can be effectively done in particularly the Australian context. And finally, we'll end up with some discussions of myths with Jacinta again, and also Jorgen Gullestrop about some of the myths that it's important to demystify, as it were, for us to understand suicide better. I'm not going to spend much time introducing our speakers because we want to concentrate on the material. There's plenty available there on the web, so I'm just going to keep things necessarily very short so we can have more of the meaty content, as it were. Now, without any further ado, I am going to hand over to Associate Professor, soon to be Professor, Kari Kovles.
Thank you very much, Mark. Dear colleagues and friends in Australia and internationally, thank you very much for joining us in celebrating 25 years of suicide research at the Australian Institute for Suicide Research and Prevention, and also 20 years of suicidology courses at Griffith University. Today, I actually will not talk about the results of our research, but I'm honored to give a brief overview of AISRAP, its history, major activities, and achievements throughout the quarter of century and our main recent activities. Most importantly, I would like to acknowledge all the people who have worked at AISRAP, and there are many photos throughout my slides to capture some of them. I would also like to acknowledge support from our multiple stakeholders and funding bodies and collaborators over the years. So now let's jump briefly into the history of AISRAP and how it all started. So, and here, when we are talking about the early days or pre-days of AISRAP, we have been in contact with Dr. Chris Cantor, a psychiatrist who was essential in establishing the Australian Institute for Suicide Research and Prevention. And how it all started was in 1986 when the Gateway Bridge was opened in Brisbane, and it was followed by a number of suicides. And Dr. Cantor started investigating Brisbane River Bridge suicides and using different types of coronial files. And he was more interested in how to make it more efficient and include different types of information in one place. It was also noted already that at that stage it seemed that Australia was at the early stages of youth suicide epidemic. So in 1988, Dr. Cantor participated at the YASP conference in Brussels and already was looking into the opportunities, what is involved in establishing suicide registers. And in 1989, Dr. Cantor submitted a proposal to get a support to set up the Queensland Suicide Register, which was successful and helped firstly to develop Queensland Health Suicide Research and Prevention Program. However, in 1995, the success was clearly there, and with support from Queensland Health and Griffith University, it was need to widen just it from the report into our institute. So here you can see the first mention and the establishment of the Australian Institute for Suicide Research and Prevention at Griffith University with the first director, Pierre Paul. So now, next, I was trying to identify what were the very first papers coming out from AISRAP. And it's really from 1996 when the papers started to come out on different topics related to suicide, not only in Australia, but also internationally. When it comes to the Queensland Suicide Register, then clearly the first paper using the data from Queensland Suicide Register came out in 1997, highlighting different types of profiles of suicide in Queensland. There were multiple changes, obviously, in the early days of the Institute to get it up and running smoothly. And in 1997, there was recruitment for a new director. And in 1998, Professor Diego De Leo, worldwide known suicide expert, was appointed as a director of the Australian Institute for Suicide Research and Prevention. And as I assume majority of you know, he remained the director of AISRAP for 18 years, and he will give him his insights after my presentations. Now, obviously, when we are talking about AISRAP, and when, as you already saw, when it comes to it was that Queensland, it was managed by the AISRAP since 1995, and in 2011, the interim Queensland Suicide Register was established as the first real-time surveillance systems. And there are ongoing developments to improve the quality of the QSR to contribute to the suicide prevention in Queensland, in collaboration with our main stakeholders, including our funders like Queensland Mental Health Commission and Queensland House and the Queensland Police Services and the Queensland Coroner's Court, Queensland. So AISRAP mission and AISRAP model, obviously it started with the main focus on research, while over the years the addition of parts, as so-called our RCT, took off by adding the educational part to it. So currently, in 2001, the further postgraduate programs were included, and senior lecturer Jacinta Hopewood will tell you more about our postgraduate certificate in suicidology and master of suicidology and how they were all set up. Now, other part definitely important to AISRAP has been training, and the training has changed and evolved over the years, and different types of options are available. And definitely currently the most important development is systematic tailored assessment for responding suicidality, the STARS program, which is going through multiple evaluations to strengthen its evidence base, and many people are clinicians or have gone through the training. Now, Life Promotion Clinic was established in 2004. So AISRAP was moving also into clinical services, and it was the first only and currently only specialized outpatient service in Australia dedicated to the assessment and treatment of individuals at increased risk of suicide. And here there are photos of the main team over very many years, led by Dr. Angelo De Giovanni. So, and in 2005, AISRAP became World Health Organization collaborating center for research and training in suicide prevention. This has involved over the years multiple different worldwide studies, including SupraMIS, but also START study. We have been running evidence reviews for the WHO Mental Health Gap Action Program, and also we are in ongoing collaboration with the Western Pacific Regional Office in order to strengthen the suicide prevention, but also surveillance systems in the region. Now, between 2008 and 2016, AISRAP was the National Centre of Excellence in Suicide Prevention, funded by the Commonwealth Department of Health and Ageing. There were multiple different activities. Here is just some snapshots of some of the important reports to inform the government in their suicide prevention activities. Over this time, 16 volumes of selected readings focusing on top suicide research papers were given out. Currently, we are still involved in the national leadership in suicide prevention research through the life-based project, which is led by the University of Melbourne and Jane Packers. So also, when it comes to the different papers, AISRAP has been very productive over years, and as you can see, it's not really slowing down. AISRAP has been involved in editing and writing multiple different books across the years, and also, of course, numerous important book chapters in different crucial books as well. Now, a brief snapshot into what are really our current most important research topics, as it wouldn't be possible for me to go through within that short time frame all what we have done. So just to mention the most important topics, of course, surveillance of suicide and self-harm, different types of evaluations. One of the very important parts is preventing suicide in workplace, but also workplace mental health, where we are collaborating with different organizations in Europe, and also most importantly in construction activities, which my colleague Vicky Ross is gonna tell you more about. And some crucial topics involve suicide bereavement and postvention. We have recently had different collaborations with different helplines, Kids Helpline, but also Lifeline. And one of the central topics over the years has been also suicidal behavior and prevention in children and young people. And also quite some focus has been on Indigenous suicidal behavior. So now AISRAP has been pretty lucky when it comes to the different types of leadership. So of course, as noted, Professor De Leo was director over 18 years, while there have been definitely quite a lot of support in that leadership. And currently, as we joined with the School of Applied Psychology, we do not really officially have a director anymore, but we still get a wonderful leadership from the school. This is the list of our current team, whom I'm very grateful, but it's definitely important to acknowledge several people working at the AISRAP over all those 25 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kari, that's wonderful. Now we should be able to hear from Professor Diego De Leo.
A very good day to everyone. This is certainly a special occasion to me after a quarter of century of the Australian Institute for Suicide Research and Prevention, which I miss very much, and which is something to which I believe I gave some contribution through the years I've been there. But let me see something of what has been AISRAP through the years. And let's commence from where in 1997, December, when I was appointed as director of AISRAP, AISRAP looked like. Well, first of all, it was located at the Bellenden Care College, the house of the students, ground floor of this. So we were in Nathan campus, and this is the house. The staff was really very, very reduced at that time. We had only Diane Bergman as 100% of her time. And then we had a psychiatrist, Chris Cantor, 50%, and two young psychologists, each of them 50% of time. This was the staff of AISRAP. AISRAP, which attracted me particularly for the possibility of having a rather unique data bank, the Queensland Suicide Register. But this is essentially due to these men, the then Queensland coroner, Michael Barnes, here depicted, who helped to fill many of the empty spaces in this Queensland Suicide Register and create a data bank that today remains one of the most influential data bank on suicide. Immediately after my appointment, I had a career in the International Association for Suicide Prevention that culminated with my presidency, and it was 1999. I had two mandates for these presidencies. I'm still deeply involved with the ISP. I'm co-chairing the Special Interest Group on Nomenclature, and a member of the Presidential Special Task Force on global emergency like COVID, which generated this. But at the beginning, I had, just for my role on suicide research and prevention, many contacts with the World Health Organization. And I believe I was behind the interest after many years of fighting, because suicide is not a disease, and WHO at the beginning was very reluctant in dealing with something that was not a disease. But in 2000, it ended with a project, with a program called simply SUPRE, the Suicide Prevention Program. And SUPRE had many aims, but one powerful aim was the constitution of an international network of researchers dealing with the suicide prevention and what was best in suicide prevention. This figure depicts the launch of the SUPREMIS, which happened in Griffith University. This is Nathan campus, and you can see the center of the picture, Giuseppe Bertolotti, which was then director of the second dedicated to design and then taking the government. 2001 saw also the creation, the launch, and I was helped by Jacinta Hogwood, the launch of certificate and master courses. It was a world first for this type of education. And we are very pleased to say that this tradition of teaching and educating still continues today after more than 20 years. After several years of efforts, and as it was in my program for the election as president of ISP, I tried to obtain a day to remind the world that suicide is the worst of human tragedies, and I tried to do that through the September 10th of 2003, and it was launched during the IASP conference in Stockholm in Sweden. Very important. 1 year after, it was the turn of the first clinic dealing exclusively with suicidal people, the Life Promotion Clinic. And this was the creation of the World Collaborating Center for WHO on suicide training and research. Ian Shigeru Omi, the head of the office in Manila, the Governor General Quentin Bryce, the Vice Chancellor Lenin in this picture, and the plate that commemorates that event. Same year, another important event, the creation of a new study. This in the Western Pacific, the area with the highest rates of suicide, which justify a common effort for this area. This effort is still going on in some place, but at the beginning, it involved many countries in the area. I was very honored to receive the title of Doctor of Science in 2007, and this is Lenin Fordi. And AISRAP also created in 2010 the first IASP regional conference here in Brisbane. You can see Michael Dudley from Sydney, Professor Brian Michara from Montreal, the then Minister of Queensland for Health, Beijing. And this is a nice picture of some of the people. Many of them had a career, started an important career in suicide research and prevention. And this was in 2011. The year after, there was in my office the foundation also Postvention Australia. And this is Alan Staines, the two of us put together ideas, and sorry for showing this, but it's a big honor to be recognized. Maybe too many recognition for the poor work from my side, but this was what happened in the lift of my building. So same year was also the year of the launch of the mental health GAP program in Geneva, and this is the participation to that important meeting. As some of you certainly know, the MH GAP is a very important program to escalate mental health assistance to countries, especially to low and middle income countries. And this is one of our gathering for a Christmas party. In this picture, you can also recognize John O'Gorman, which helped a lot, I believe, AISRAP from the beginning, and an important visitor, Tom Joyner from the United States. Tom is still the leading figure in suicide and life-threatening behavior. One of the things we are particularly proud that he has been contributing to the fencing of the beautiful Story Bridge in Brisbane, an iconic place, unfortunately, for too many deaths by suicide over there. and the fencing had been helpful in containing a lot of these terrible tributes to death. And we have been trafficking for a number of years to obtain this result, but we were pretty proud of it. And these are my last will. When I left in a billboard a number of potential projects to be continued after my departure because I was unwell at the time and feeling to be even more unwell, and so decided to return to Italy. But I'm still here to tell the story, so I'm particularly grateful for this opportunity. So I thank you for the attention for these 10 minutes, and I hope I gave you some sight of thinking towards the long journey of AISRAP, and good fortune for the future, good fortune to the leaders of this important institution for what has achieved and what will produce for Australia in the future. Have a great day.
Thank you, Diego, for that. Now we're going to change from looking at the past to looking at what's happening currently with the Queensland Suicide Register with Dr. Stuart Lask.
Thanks, Mark, for that. Yeah, so my name's Stuart. I'm the project manager of the Queensland Suicide Register. I work on it alongside Ghazala, Bridget and Amra as research assistants, and Kyrie is the QSR principal researcher. And just wanted to let you know that 40% of our staff do have lived experience, to my knowledge, and I do have informed consent to share that with you. So in terms of acknowledgements for this presentation, I wanted to acknowledge that every number in this presentation represents a person. These people are much more than a number to all of us, and we acknowledge the impact of their death on others. So my presentation will go pretty quick today in that I'll cover a lot of content. So I'll be talking about just a one-slider on introducing you to Queensland Suicide Mortality Registers, for those of you who haven't heard of them, the impact and uses of the Queensland Suicide Register, the QSR, over time, notable uses of the interim Queensland Suicide Register, the IQSR, in recent times, and current and emerging trends and impact of COVID-19. So we have two interrelated suicide mortality registers in Queensland. The first, the QSR, holds data from 1990 to 2017, and it's the more detailed data set. There are four main documents that inform it, and they are the Form 1 Police Report of Death to a Coroner, which we received from the Queensland Police Service and the Coroners Court of Queensland. The website contained data for the 2008 to 2012 period, and the Excel spreadsheet actually dated back to 2003. So predating that reporting, we actually had in the top row of that table, the QSR had recorded 92 children aged from 9 to 14 who had died by suicide. And then predating those figures on the website, we had 64 children aged 10 to 14, and then sort of predating any ABS figures that I know of, we still have 37 children aged 10 to 14 that we think had died by suicide. So, and so now the sort of convention is to report children aged 5 to 17. So this study done a while ago as well was the first to look at lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender suicide in Australia, to my knowledge. And yeah, I think I'm not sure what studies have been done since, but we are planning to do another analysis of this data, and we currently have 125 suicides or suspected suicides of people who were identified or who we identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender. And I don't use IQA here because we have not seen or been able to detect anyway any suicides or suspected suicides by people who were intersex, queer, questioning or asexual. I think intersex we would be able to find from the coronial data, but perhaps not those other groups. Diego also had a fair tussle with the ABS about suicide mortality data. So there were 4 papers around 2009, 2010, maybe a bit later, from us in total about that. There were also researchers, there's 4 citations on the left, researchers from Flinders University in South Australia, and I think another uni in South Australia, also writing about that. And the most thorough report is the AIHW one done by James Harrison. So that sort of called attention to revisions processes and the need for revisions in suicide statistics over time. So this is just some of our newer data, and I'll look forward so I can see it. We have recorded, so the ABS reports data by year of registration and year of occurrence, as you can see in that table on the left. We just report data by year of occurrence. So in 2020, we have reported 68 more suspected suicides by year of occurrence than the ABS. And I think we reported 20 more than the ABS's year of registration. There are some years where the ABS and we and the ABS are very close and identical, like 2019, you can see we have the exact same number for year of occurrence. 2017, we're one off, and 2017 had quite a high number of suicides. You can see over the period down the bottom of that table, the ABS has reported 984 less suicides by year of registration than us, and 300 less by year of occurrence than us over this 15-year period. So I sort of graphed those percentage differences on the right by year of occurrence and year of registration. You can see there's a period 2013 to 2019 when we're really getting quite close to each other, and that's just sort of dipped down in that last year, which I'll talk more about in a bit. So I'm really proud that 9.4% of the 64 journal articles, and obviously some published before my time, using QSR or IQSR data have focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who died by suicide. So there were 4 journal articles in the past, and these are just a couple of ones, both open access, that have come out this year that Mandy Gibson, a PhD student, has been working on. And I'm just going to go to the notes for a second. So they're looking at the first associations between cultural factors and suicide rates for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and the first evidence for First Nations people globally of associations between cultural connection and Indigenous suicide rates in disadvantaged communities. So I would encourage you to go and have a look at those if you're interested in that area. This was also published this year. It's also open access. It's looking at maternal deaths by suicide from 2004 to 2017. So I think this is a particularly tragic topic. So these women had died by suicide within 12 months of birth, after a termination of pregnancy, after a miscarriage or stillbirth, and after a current pregnancy. This is a word cloud I did in 2018 of QSR dissemination over time, so there would have been a few less journal articles around that time. So you can see there's been big focus on Indigenous and farmers and firearms and methods. And that link on the right is it's on our website. Our website is a bit of a maze, but you'll hopefully find it there. So the QSR has been used in evaluation of interventions. So yeah, this was Christopher Ganter's first study that he did, and yeah, unfortunately someone jumped off the Gateway Bridge at the opening ceremony, and then there was 9 further suicides at the site within the first year. And this was 2014 when this article on the right came out that evaluated whether there was a displacement effect to the Story Bridge after the barriers went up, and the conclusion was that suicides reduced by 53% from the Gateway Bridge, and there was no evidence of a displacement effect to the Story Bridge. So that was really good news. And I did have a graph, but I took that out, so I've just got the table. This is looking at the Story Bridge specifically. So in 2012, we detected that there was a hotspot occurring at the Story Bridge, and worked with the council, put the barriers up. The barriers were completed in December 2015. We can see suicides from the Story Bridge in the 5 years beforehand. There were 39. In the 5 years afterwards, we've gone to under 5. I can't report that for privacy. So the percentage decrease there is over 87.2%. To see if there's a displacement effect, we looked at suburbs and postcodes bordering the Story Bridge, but there are also decreases there. However, the Brisbane inner city statistical area level 4 did increase during that time. So. Just in evaluating exposures, obviously we've done that more recently with COVID-19. So you can kind of evaluate interventions or exposures with the QSR. And both these papers are getting a little old now. We have sent our data up to and including August 2021 by age, sex and suicide method to the International COVID-19 Suicide Prevention Research Collaboration in September, and they currently have 61 data sets from 32 countries, Jane told me the other day, so I think that data is currently being analysed. So this is just what's happening long-term in Queensland. So I'll take you through males first. We've got the highest ever rate in 1998. Got the lowest ever in, I think that's 2006 at 19.7. We've got a recent high in 2017 at 25.7. Then we've gone down for a couple of years, and then we went up by 4.7% the rate from 2019 to 2020. Persons, our highest ever is also when males were highest. We also had a high in 2017, understandably, and then we've gone from 14.9 to 15.1 per 100,000 people. So that was a 1% increase from 2019 to 2020. Females, we had our highest ever rate per 100,000 people in 2017, our lowest ever in 1993, and we've gone down by 4.7% from 2019 to 2020, which is really good news. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who died by suspected suicide from 2017 to September 2021, we have seen decreases in the numbers from 2019 to 2020, decreases in the proportions from 2019 onwards, and the age standardised rate has decreased year on year slightly since 2018. And we have cross-checked up until June 30th with the Queensland Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages to minimise missing data on Indigenous status there. So just in terms of all suspected suicides from January 1 to September 30th, 2015 to 2021, our 2021 numbers are tracking a little higher than we would like. In more recent updates, it has now dropped below the 2017 number, so it's sort of growing at a slower rate. The number is growing at a slower rate relative to 2017 at the moment. This is a join point I did a little time ago, so it just included data up until July 2021. Poisson variance, homoscedastic, might skip that, I'm going to skip it. And normally distributed DV, so we didn't log transform the data. And we don't see any join points in terms of changes in the crude suicide rate over time. I did try and run it yesterday, but that's what happened on the right side of the slide. It just took all day, so I didn't get it done, I'm sorry. So the strengths and limitations of the join point, it doesn't not assume when a change in suspected suicides might occur. We don't really know that. With interrupted time series analyses, we sort of make a guess about when it might occur, and it can accommodate multiple change points in trends. It's frequentist, orthodox, classical statistics, so it assumes you have a random sample, and as you can see, it's computationally intensive currently with the version I've downloaded. So I hope you can see this. This is a forest plot. It's looking at crude suspected suicide rates for the COVID-19 period from February 1st, 2020 to September 2021 versus the pre-COVID period, January 2015 to January 2021, stratified by season, the rate ratios and the 95% confidence intervals. So just the text on the right, one means the rate is the same during COVID as before COVID. So the conclusion is it doesn't appear that the crude rates have changed. The point estimates, which are the coloured dots, suggest we need to be careful, mindful about summer and autumn during COVID. So extra vigilance this December and May. Assumptions of this, fewer assumptions than strengths, fewer assumptions in a multivariable analysis, so lower possibility of a biased result, doesn't enable simultaneous control of several confounding factors like time-varying confounders like temperature, air pollution and long-term trends, and I need to stratify it by age as well. Just wanted to acknowledge the Queensland Government, the Queensland Mental Health Commission, Queensland Health, the Coroner's Court of Queensland, Queensland Police Service, past and current QSR and IQSR research assistants and principal researchers and other assisting staff, Wendy and other admin staff. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Stuart. Now we're going to move on to Vicky Ross, who's going to talk about her research identifying a high-risk group, young apprentices.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon to everyone. So yes, today I'm going to be talking about a very important research project which we conducted in collaboration with Mates in Construction. And yes, we investigated workplace bullying, mental health and suicidality in construction industry apprentices. And I would like to acknowledge my co-authors on this important work, Shana Matthew, Nia Wardani, Jorgen Gullestrup and Kyrie Coles. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to present this afternoon. So I'm going to start by setting the scene a little bit about the long-term history we have between AISRAP and Mates in Construction research collaboration. Then I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the Apprentices research and how it came about. I'm going to take you through the study design, then the qualitative component, which was the focus groups, the quantitative component, which was an online survey of apprentices. We're going to go through the key findings and what they mean and the implications and where to next. So before I begin, I'd like to start by just setting the scene a little bit about this long-term collaboration between AISRAP and Mates, starting with a really important piece of research back in 2005 conducted by Travis Heller, Jacinta Horgood and Diego De Leo. And this was the first bit of research that looked really into suicides in construction workers, and they were able to identify really very high rates of suicide in this group as a high-risk group. And they actually found that construction workers were almost 40% more likely to die by suicide than other similar working age males, which was really quite alarming results. And so it was this initial report back in 2005 that really formed the foundation for the formation of Mates in Construction. And as you can see on the slide, that this was published as a journal paper in 2007. And since this time, we've worked on a number of research projects with Mates. So we've done a mixed method evaluation project. We have done a longitudinal assessment of 2 programs of mates, so comparing their MAT and GAT training. And we've also we've evaluated the mates and energy program for the energy sector. So these are a few examples of the types of projects we've done over the years leading up to the Apprentices work. So this research is very important, but I really wanted to highlight today, in the spirit of our celebrations of AISRAP's 25 years, that the great friendship that we have with mates. And as you can see in these photos from a lot of smiling faces and a few wine glasses here and there, that we really have a great time together, when we get together, whether it's for work or pleasure. And I think we all feel very fortunate to have such a long-term and great working relationship with mates. So back to the serious stuff. So I'm going to give you some background on how the Apprentices project came about. So we know from a very strong body of research that construction workers are a very high risk group for suicide. We know that young Australian male construction workers are twice as likely to die by suicide than other young Australian males. And we have some research that suggests that these suicides are linked to psychosocial factors, so things such as substance abuse, job stress and workplace bullying. But when we looked at the existing research, it was fairly limited, and very much limited at that stage, to qualitative studies, which traditionally have small samples and then obviously don't generalise well to the wider population. So what our aim was to explore what the key issues were for apprentices from their perspectives, and we wanted to learn more about their concerns, so things such as mental health and wellbeing and bullying and suicidality. And we applied an exploratory sequential mixed methods design, which is more simple than it sounds, and you can see in that diagram by Creswell. In this situation, it involved 2 studies. So study 1 was a qualitative study where we ran focus groups with apprentices, and this then fed into study 2, which was a much larger scale quantitative study of all Queensland apprentices. So I'm going to take you through our first study with the focus groups. So here we were really aiming to explore the issues that were really going on from apprentices, and we wanted to get this from their own perspectives. We ran 6 focus groups with a total of 57 apprentices, and we were very fortunate to have a tremendous facilitator who just did a wonderful job of making participants feel comfortable and encouraging them to be able to speak about what was important to them. So when we collected that data, we conducted a thematic analysis, and a number of themes came out, but the big thing that just emerged across all of the focus groups was the experience of bullying. And this was quite descriptive. So we had descriptions of apprentices being yelled at, sworn at, having tools thrown at them, being threatened in a physical way. So it was quite surprising to hear so many reports of bullying. We heard a lot about variation in the quality of supervisors. So I do need to stress that there were quite a few apprentices that said they had excellent supervisors and they were very happy with them, just to balance things. But there were a percentage of supervisors that we heard some horrible stories, and apprentices talked about how they really had a lot of anxiety about turning up on job sites, and particularly if they were moving sites, and who their supervisor might be. And they had a lot of anxiety, and they spoke of a fear of humiliation, which was something that happened on job sites for apprentices. We also heard from apprentices about the stress they experienced and how they managed it, and they seemed to have quite a lot of insight into their stress. And we heard they talked about how they would bring their stress home after work, and they had insight into the fact that this had quite a negative impact on their relationships, so whether that would be a partner or their families or their housemates. So they had quite a bit of insight into how that was very negative. And there was another theme around mental health and the stigma of mental health, and we heard very strongly from the apprentices that if they were experiencing mental health issues, they definitely wouldn't ask for help because of the stigma involved. So we took these really valuable results that we obtained from the focus groups, and we used this to inform the development of our online survey. So we were concerned about how much we heard about bullying, so we really wanted to estimate the prevalence of bullying in Queensland apprentices, hence a large-scale survey. While we were doing this, we wanted to obtain a snapshot of their mental health and wellbeing. We wanted to explore further their perceptions of the quality of their supervisors, as well as suicide awareness and literacy, and their exposure to suicidal behaviours, because they're obviously working in a high-risk group for suicide, so we needed to know more about that. In terms of method, we were very fortunate with our collaboration with MATES, that we were also able to work with the Department of Education, Employment and Training, and they were absolutely wonderful and were able to send a link to our online survey out to the mobile phone numbers of all 27,000 apprentices across Queensland for whom they had numbers, so that was hugely helpful. Just looking briefly at the measures that we use. So obviously we had bullying measures, and we had both an objective and a subjective measure of bullying. We included a lot about worker demographics, because it was very important to be able to compare these groups and to see if there were differences between the different employer types or sectors within the industry. We looked further into perceptions of supervisors, and we also included, importantly, measures of mental health and wellbeing, such as the K6 and the WHO5. We looked at exposure to suicide literacy. Importantly, we asked about suicidal thoughts within the past 12 months, and we explored more about those topics of managing stress, alcohol and drugs. So I'm just going to take you through the results. So looking at the descriptive results first, so we didn't expect to have a high response rate, because the apprentices are, as you can imagine, can be quite a difficult group to reach, and probably not wanting to spend a lot of time completing surveys. So we were quite pleased. We got almost 1,800 responses, so we were pleased to have that size. Obviously that sample was reduced a little due to missing data. And as you can see, almost 90% of the sample were males, as we predicted, with a mean age of 24.8 years. The really important things that came out of the descriptive results was, firstly, this 35% of our participants reported that they had experienced thoughts about suicide in the last 12 months. And we found this is an incredibly high proportion, and found that quite alarming. We weren't expecting that type of result. And we also saw that 30% also reported that they experienced bullying, which is extremely high. And also very high exposure to suicide, as you can see. So 65% knew someone who had died by suicide, and 75% knew someone who had attempted suicide. So just moving into further results. So we ran a series of regression analyses because we wanted to have a look at the factors that were associated with both bullying and suicidal ideation. And what I've done here, rather than bore everyone with tables and tables of results, I've just very briefly summarised the key findings from the regression models. So if we have a look here, we found that bullying significantly associated with, as we might expect, with lower levels of wellbeing, higher levels of psychological distress, and being a third-year apprentice. Now I wanted to add here, just to for some context, that because we had quite a bit of missing data, we also ran some sensitivity analyses, and out of those analyses we did see some indication of some other factors that may be related to bullying, and we'd have to do some further analyses to confirm this. But the other potential factors related to bullying was not being a first-year apprentice, working for a larger organisation, working for the plumbing trades, working nights away from home, and substance use. And I just wanted to touch very briefly on that finding. We kept seeing this pattern that appears that first-year apprentices are less likely to be bullied than the older apprentices, and we really thought we'd find the opposite there. We had thought about some various theories for this, and one possibility, it may be that because a lot of apprentices start their apprenticeship while they're still at school, and it may be that that first year while they're still at school might be a protective factor, and perhaps bosses leave them alone when they first start, and perhaps they think apprentices are fair game as they get older. So that's one of our theories at this stage, and it's certainly something we want to look into a little further. So looking at factors associated with suicidal ideation in apprentices, we see again psychological distress, lower levels of wellbeing, substance use, and knowing someone who has attempted suicide. And once again, from our sensitivity analyses, another thing that came up was working for a group training organisation. This is where apprentices are moved around a lot and have different supervisors, so you can see that that could cause a bit of distress. So what are the implications of our findings? So very briefly summing up, I think obviously these very high levels of suicidality and levels of bullying are really quite alarming, and I think that they really highlight the need for a tailored intervention for apprentices. And I think the other thing that comes out of this research is the fact that it appears that bullying is very entrenched in the culture of the construction sector. So obviously the intervention would need to, as has been discussed, would need to really target trying to make a cultural change in the workplace so that bullying is not seen as acceptable within the industry. And I think finally, I think we all agree that that we should see this opportunity as a great early intervention opportunity for the industry in intervening for these young people, which may actually prevent the high rate of suicides that we're seeing in older construction workers. So it's a really great opportunity to hopefully intervene early. So moving on from the implications, so the next steps related to these implications. So when we finished the initial apprentices research, Mates in Construction conducted a very comprehensive and widespread industry consultation, and this resulted in a specific set of recommendations, obviously including an intervention program for apprentices. So I'm pleased to say in response to these recommendations, Mates have been very busy, and they are currently developing a suite of workplace intervention programs which relate specifically to those set of recommendations. And so the intervention programs will target apprentices, their supervisors, and also the general workforce in the construction industry. And so AISRAP's role in the next steps is to develop an evaluation strategy for these programs. And that's obviously hugely important in being able to provide a body of evidence to show that if the programs are effective. So we'll be working on that, and the first step there will be to pilot the programs, and piloting is very important in looking at the feasibility and looking at the moving parts of the programs and what parts work well, what parts might need to be improved. And then from there the programs are refined, implemented, and then hopefully rigorously evaluated. And ideally we do this through controlled trials. So some exciting things ahead in the next steps. And I'm just going to finish just with speaking of some outputs from this research. So on the left is the original report of the apprentices that we conducted, and I think this is available on the Mates website for anyone who would like to have a look at it. I should mention we were also nominated for and received an award through IAP International in 2020, and there's a photo of us on the right celebrating remotely because it was in the middle of COVID. So that was fun. And also we've recently published 2 papers on the apprentices' work. So one with a focus on bullying and mental health, and the other with a focus on suicidal ideation, as I've just taken you through. So that concludes my presentation, and thank you very much everyone for your attention.
Thank you, Vicky, for that very clear presentation showing the problem and some ways in which it might be resolved. And when we're talking about education, it gives a good segue into Jacinta Hallgood here, who will be talking about education around suicide and suicide prevention in the Australian context with her colleague Ingrid Ozols, who will be joining us from Melbourne virtually.
Thanks so much, Mark. So I am going to take you on a bit of a condensed journey over the 20-year journey of our postgraduate programs. And I have invited a dear colleague, Ingrid Ozols, to come and share some of her reflections and her journey at the end of our presentation. So where have we come from? I thought it'd be important to have a little bit of an archival investigation, and I came up with what I could just to fit into the time that we have. And that is our history timeline. It was the year 2000 that we commenced the development or the building up of the postgraduate programs. I was fortunately employed in January 2000, so I was fortunate to join a very, very small team of people. Some of them are, you'll see shortly in my presentation, who have been a part of the Queensland Government Youth Suicide Prevention Strategy, training needs analysis, delivery of and development of training and evaluation. And it was this first phase, the training needs analysis, in fact, when we conducted semi-structured interviews and surveys for 1,300 cross-sectoral workers in Queensland, that we identified not only a need for training, and gatekeeper training was not saturated at the time, but a need for something a bit more specialised. And so it was Diego's idea to address this particular gap by developing up tertiary investigations and study in suicide prevention. And as you would have heard from Diego earlier, they were the first of their type in the world at the time. And so Griffith University, of course, supported us to do this, and you can see just moving downwards from the left-hand side, in 2001, they supported the introduction of the Graduate Certificate in Suicide Prevention Studies. Back many, many years, we had a very, very small cohort on campus mode. I still am in contact with several of the graduates today, which I'm very fortunate to share later towards the presentation. Then in 2002, because of the demand and popularity and success of that, the university supported us to extend this program into what we refer to as the Master of Suicidology. Back then it was 2 years, with a third year being an honours year for those wanting to do a dissertation. Now, since 2014, it's a 3-year program. So in 2004, it was quite advanced to have online learning here at Griffith, and we were awarded a flexible learning grant to build up our programs into online mode as well. Of course, all of the intensive weekends of learning, which were quite intense across 2 semesters, were just supported by online learning mechanisms, so no lectures online. It wasn't until 2008 that the programs went fully online, the Masters and the Grad Cert, and this was to respond to an increasing demand not only internationally, but also with regards to accessibility. And so our busy lives continue to tell us where we should focus in our education. And of course, we had more sophisticated mechanisms to allow us to do more engagement with students. So here we are today, still fully online with our students. And just a very brief overview of the programs. So we have the Graduate Certificate in Suicidology and the Masters. And you can see the main difference is the period of time, plus more specialised and deeper understandings, in fact, in the Masters over Year 2, and an option in Year 3 for people to do either dissertation or elective courses. I'll talk a bit about the career outcomes from that shortly. However, let's turn back to the very inception year. This the little pictures on the left-hand side, you can see are the small group of staff that I was fortunate to work with in the building up of the programs in 2000. We have, in fact, Gary King in the middle on the left-hand side, who currently is an adjunct lecturer with us and also an alumni you'll hear from later. Steve Morgan down the bottom left from nursing. And of course, at the top right is Virginia Davies, then Virginia Andrews, and she was the backbone admin to our programs. So it was Diego's desire that we should provide a 360-degree perspective of the phenomenon, not a medical, not a social, not a psychological, but an altogether integrated understanding. And to do that, it had to be informed, of course, by science, but as well lived experience. And we had quite input in lived experience regarding what was needed, workforce needs, and also had to be informed by practice and community. And so, of course, there was a curriculum advisory committee that helped us from the field, our stakeholders, government, non-government, lived experience, to tell us how it should be at that particular point in time. So here's our original teaching team. Take close note of some of the photos, because these, unfortunately or fortunately, have moved into some quite wise pictures. We'll have a look firstly here at the bottom. You can see our second year master course teaching staff, and we needed to cover euthanasia, assisted suicide, ethical legal interpretations, suicide risk assessment, pharmacological and psychotherapeutic, as well as public health approaches. Then we grew. So over the years, with increased demand, particularly around 2008, I note Dr. Kyra Coves there has entered the scene at this point in time. And we also have a couple of alumni who actually became teaching staff that we recruited, Peter Bazzano and Carmen Bettridge. And also Carolina Krasinska continued for some time as well, lecturing in our courses. And then the final staff who are current today include, of course, myself, but also Kyrie. And I want you to have a look at this next very invaluable teaching member, and that is Professor Frank Buggies. He was also with us in the year 2002 when the second year, or the Masters, was launched. So I want to extend my gratitude and acknowledgement to Frank, who's been with us for so long, and Carmen Bettridge. So I also want to acknowledge we've had many guest lectures, which I think is really important over the years. This is more recent few years here in front of you. It's just a list of people to just demonstrate that we don't expect that we have the specialist knowledge to cover every single topic that's essential in our 360-degree perspective of education. You can see a range of lived experience speakers here from Australia, Bronwyn Edwards and Martina McGrath. We have some other medical interpretations and knowledge bases, postvention, pharmacological, etc. So we're very grateful to our guest lecturers and our administration support. We had many admin officers leading up to the point in time when Diane Dunn arrived, when we were separated at that point from School of Applied Psychology. I've put Diane Dunn there because it was extremely important in the year 2014 when we moved, extended our program with the Australian Qualifications Framework, and we moved into a more advanced space with our teaching. A lot of changes occurred for several years around that period. And I want to acknowledge our admin support and program support officers currently in the School of Applied Psychology. And finally, our team would never be able to produce the work that it does in terms of education without the input of the workforce. So we have a great representation of people on our committee that keeps us ensuring we meet workforce industry needs. So this is just this is a flashback. I'm just going to say we've come a long way from our on-campus, I think that was about 2003, lectures using VHS and overhead transparencies. It was very, very different. And for those who are not aware, there's lots of documentation about what overhead transparencies include and the effort required when you need to make changes and edits, etc. And of course, we had great catering for our intensive weekend lectures. And we've moved from that position to one which is online with the use of the learning management system Blackboard at Griffith University. But I'm pleased to say with increased flexibility and engagement facilities, we move in 23 to Canvas platform. So what are the career outcomes from our graduates? Given suicide is a multifaceted phenomenon, we've heard this over and over again, it is absolutely relevant that we have multidisciplinary responses to this phenomenon. And so our graduates have appeared across all of these different fields. They've been engaged in non-clinical and clinical workforce roles, academia and research. And these specialist capabilities we will hear shortly from some of our alumni about. But I just want to celebrate with this slide. I absolutely have had an invaluable learning journey myself, learning so much from our students and their achievements, and I love the celebration time at the end of their degree when we all get together. And I think that this is the nature of caring profession that we have, when people can really stick to what is a very challenging degree in this length of time and come out the other side. So I want to acknowledge our students to that end. And I also just want to show you, this is a representation as well as where they are today, the impacts that the program has had on our stakeholders' careers.
A graduate of the Graduate Certificate in Suicide Prevention Studies and the Masters of Suicidology through the Australian Institute for Suicide Research and Prevention. I completed these programs approximately 10 years ago. I found them immensely helpful in my professional career. I highly recommend them to anybody entering the field or who already is working the field and wants to add to what studies they've got. I found the content absolutely contemporary, up-to-date, world-class. I found the lecturers both very well respected in the field, but also highly interactive with participants. There was a very small number in the class, so you allowed a lot of contact with your lecturers. I certainly found it was well respected around the world. I've been over to the States doing work, and found the program was both well recognised and very respected over there. I highly recommend it for anybody considering wanting more information about the area of suicide, and for me particularly youth suicide prevention.
Currently I'm an Assistant Director at the National Mental Health Commission. I'm a Lifeline Telephone Crisis Supporter, and I'm founder of Stop Deaf Suicide. I completed the AISRAP Master of Suicidology program in 2015, and since then I've used my training to provide evidence-based advice to governments on suicide prevention policy, confidently supported people at risk of suicide and their loved ones, and guided grassroots suicide prevention initiatives to make sure that limited resources really were focused on initiatives that were most likely to make a difference. Studying with AISRAP really has provided me with a comprehensive knowledge base that I can apply to any aspect of suicide prevention.
So I thank our alumni for being able to present their stories, and we had several others. Unfortunately, we only had time for a couple, but that was Mr. Gary King and Madeline Mooney. And now I'd like to introduce Ingrid Ozols, and I'd like us to welcome Ingrid, and it'll be our pleasure to listen to your story, Ingrid. Thank you.
Thank you. Happy anniversary or happy birthday. I wish I could sing, but luckily you've given me a time limit. This has been a life-changing, life-affirming educational program for me that's given me so many personal and professional gifts that I'll never be able to thank the team for this vision and for this opportunity to walk with me, and for me to walk with the most amazing, knowledgeable, passionate, dedicated team, especially during a time when it was very, very difficult. I was suicidal. I have the lived experience of doing suicide watch, of complex trauma, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts and bereavement from early childhood. And it was that catalyst that got me to do this program. It was an opportunity for me to face my enemy, my shame, my pain, those of the people that I've loved all around me. I had to find something to grab onto. And this was one of those opportunities to grab onto something to help me cope through a really difficult time. And for me, over 20 years in mental health and suicide prevention, I've been able to use so much of my life experience, but often I felt like I didn't have credibility, and I felt like I needed a piece of paper. Didn't think there was one, found this one. Still not to say that one needs a piece of paper to be compassionate. Doesn't mean that a piece of paper can teach us everything, but my gosh, this did give me hope when I was feeling hopeless. This opportunity has given me an opportunity to stand up for something that I believe in, for something that I've not had the courage to do, to face, to talk about, and knowing that I can be proud and stand up, wobbly legs and all, and talk about and help others to feel that this is actually a subject that we can all talk about, because it is based around humanity, the human condition, that we can hold hope for one another, to have a natural and more easy conversation about what is so uncomfortable. And this degree, this postgraduate program, the people who developed it, who given this love, that's what's helped me to stand up and do all the amazing things I can do in my career, both on a policy level, advocacy, peer support, workforce. I feel like I've been able to work in so many different areas. And in saying this, I actually want to say happy birthday to all of us, to all of you, because this program was ahead of its time. Now, sadly, the community is ready. It needs this. It needs to embrace the learnings and the wisdom that comes in this program. And I am so honoured. I'm so proud that you walked with me. Thank you for getting me here. Thank you for believing in us as students, and that this knowledge is really important. And I am so excited for the next 25 years, 20 years, 100 years, that our next generations can learn about suicidology. And I've gone over time, sorry.
We're very grateful. Thank you for sharing that invaluable story, Ingrid. And I just want to finish with I guess a bit of a where to from here future, and I'll pick up on your readiness concept there, Ingrid, because I think the readiness is there. We're ready to look at the complementary role of tertiary-based, much deeper, I guess, broader, comprehensive understandings in both research and contemporary practice. The stakeholders in our sector in Australia, 76 of them have told us so. We need to continue to listen to them in their lived experience voice. We need to complement our gatekeeper training, which is well versed across Australia and globally, but we need to pick up the game on being able to provide a different sort of lens to complement that as well. And we need to respond while we're doing this, delivering our learning through increased and enhanced technological delivery modes, which we're hoping to do and improve on. And also we want to make sure that we never lose sight of our goal, and that is supporting our workforce to continue to gain knowledge, to be critically appraising, to be compassionate and skilled, and mostly we want to be able to expand suicidology education across Australia. Many universities are welcome to offer this program. So look, I'd like to thank you all for having me, and I want to especially extend a thank you to our students for joining me in the last 20 years in this journey, and all of the supportive staff. But mostly I want you to take care of yourself, please, everyone, through all of these presentations. It's the potential to be emotionally impactful for some people. So please reach out for help and adhere to the support lines that we provide for you on the screen at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacinta. And we're going to keep Jacinta here, and she's going to be talking now with Jorgen about facts and myths around suicide. And we've actually had one question as well about what is the major cause of death from suicide in Australia?
That would be that would be hanging is the main method. And I think that's quite across both genders. Yeah, thanks, Mark. So, welcome, Jorgen.
Well, thank you very much. I can only echo Ingrid's comment in terms of actually the value of getting that piece of paper that could even make a Danish plumber trustworthy in some connections. But so I'm so honored to be part of it. I'm really pleased to be part of today's discussion.
We're very happy to have you. So, alumni, Jorgen.
So we're supposed to talk about myths around suicide. And one of the things that sort of dawned on me, there's actually a recent book that came out by Rory O'Connor that talk about when it's the darkest.
This one.
Are we on screen?
When
it's the darkest, that deals with all those kind of myths in a broader sense. And you can sort of just perhaps not give it justice and try to cover all of it. Maybe we just want to cover two of them.
Absolutely. I have to agree with you on this matter, just because myths are a bit more complex, I think, and particularly the myths where we're trying to dispel the myths, address those underpinning myths, ideas and attitudes with science. So,
and given it's my idea, I make the pick. So I'm going to pick that.
Just as you were as a student.
Absolutely, I do the agenda here. Yeah. So I think we should deal with the idea that suicide is mental illness, and the idea that asking about suicide or talking about suicide can cause suicide, because I think that's what's a living myth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an important myth. And the other myth, which is important to talk about, is... Oh, you've said...
Yeah, I told you, of course. Yeah.
I was just seeing if you're on your toes, making sure.
One of the things that was quite profound for me in terms of when I did my study, there was the history of suicide, how the view of suicide had changed over time. And I think that's quite relevant to talking about suicide as mental illness. So maybe we can just start with that. Sure,
Jorgen. Yes, look, I think my first knowledge around learnings of the history of suicide as mental illness comes from antiquity. If we go back to early Middle Antiquity, this is when suicide was considered heroic. It was an act of heroes, basically, and it was just the emergence of a new Christian community that started to perform this very frequently, suicide acts, martyr acts of the martyr. Martyrdom was became extremely popular by Christian Donatists. And it was also at that time that it became so popular that the council churches decided to outlaw it because it was just getting too out of control. And so the churches came in, and in fact they outlawed suicide. Suicide became considered a sin. You can see, and the criminalisation of suicide began to take place, and that connotation brought, of course, legal ramifications. But probably one of the harshest criminal outcomes for suicide was that on the bereaved. So there was harsh punishments, taking away belongings, and quite a cruel experience. And the ridiculed nature of outcomes for them was quite big. So, of course, when the legal interpretation of suicide became quite prominent, of course this meant that there had to be a defence. And so exactly. So looking forward, but we had both defence and the defence was non compos mentis. So it was the decision that suicide had to be caused by mental illness, and potentially this was observed as well at the time, and which of course, if you didn't have mental illness, you were considered a felon, and of course you were punished. But if not, you were you were of non compos mentis. And so the compassion, I guess, that slightly came in at that point in time, and the medical profession dominating here, meant that suicide increased over the 16th and 17th century to be seen as non compos mentis until 1800. And all suicides were deemed to be of non compos mentis.
It's an interesting journey, isn't it? You start from suicide being a considered tool that people decide to becoming a felon, a crime, to becoming a mental illness. And then in the 1800s, we start getting a social context when we start talking to Durkheim.
Yes, you did listen.
I did remember a few things, yes.
This is the case, I believe, through the research courses. We did, we kind of extended our understanding of this multifaceted phenomenon. And Durkheim's work, Emil Durkheim, in his impression and interpretation, was that suicide was caused by factors outside of the individual, social factors, etc. And so that blame, that whole that everything's about the individual, was becoming quite prominent at the time. And I think that was backed up by science, of course, and that the global studies by Durkheim showing across countries that there were macro factors, social, economic, and etc., that had a lot to do with suicide rates, different.
So what do we? So we have Durkheim now saying there's some social context for the happening. We have a medical profession that says it's about insanity and mental illness. What do we actually know about it in reality?
Well, that's a good question.
I only ask good questions.
I hope to match that with a good answer. So, look, I'm sure many of you students would have learned, and many people out there know now, that the traditional understanding of mental illness in association with suicide is that suicide has up to 90% of suicide cases has been associated with a mental illness, and has been shown through psychotropic studies. However, that's a traditional view, and increasingly we're seeing investigations and papers showing that this isn't always the case. In fact, our Queensland Suicide Register shows approximately 50%, just over 50% of cases, unfortunately and tragically, have experienced a mental illness. And if we look at Asia, I think Diego might have mentioned somewhere in his speech as well that where the majority, 60% of suicides occur, only approximately 40% of those are associated with mental illness, which brings to bear that there's got to be something else, cultural factors, and certainly not everyone with a mental illness goes on to die by suicide, and not everyone who has suicidal thoughts necessarily have a mental illness. So this is quite a complex thing, but Julie, I do want to make a point, and that is that it's really important to also understand that where there are cases where mental illness is quite a strong contributing factor, but we need to keep in mind, scrutinise what it is about that mental illness. Is it the mental illness per se that we need to therefore treat medically or pharmacologically, or is it situations associated with that?
Because I can't help wondering that we have never treated as many people for mental ill health, both pharmacologically and treatment, and yet at the same time the suicide rate remains stubbornly high.
Yes.
So yeah.
Well,
So but that being said, it's an interesting sort of between the social and the pharmacological, because I know from my own lived experience, I certainly probably wouldn't have survived without some sort of pharmacological intervention.
right.
And yet I work in an area where we work highly with the social context of suicide.
Yes.
And it gives hope that we have community acts that can make a difference, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
And I guess you've also highlighted the importance of an integrated response, clinical, non-clinical, and we need to be able to find that balance for individuals by hearing their expert story. And that's the point.
That was really one of the things, again, by doing the master's course, where we actually pull all the disciplines together, you know, coming from an ex-trade union background where it sort of feels like a demarcation dispute between the social sciences and the medicals, but we actually start saying we actually need to play nicely in the sandpit together.
We do. We absolutely do. So, how do you want to do you want to move on to our second
I think so.
myth, given our time? Let's talk about.
We also just as an aside, got a quick question. Is there being much done between suicide and homicidal ideation, and also between drugs and intoxicated people?
Wow.
Just as a
That's
throwing that in there.
There is actually emerging work being done on looking at what are the common elements between homicide and suicide, in forensic settings in particular is my knowledge. And I think we need to do a closer look at some of that, because we do know that there is an overlap in terms of vulnerability across, you know, with suicide and homicide in particularly forensic settings. And so, yes, that certainly needs, I guess, a bit more attention, increasing attention at the moment, at least in the literature. We've still got a long way to go. And your second question concerns drug and alcohol treatment. There's certainly agreement that drug and alcohol is one of the major risk factors, contributing factors to suicide. Do you want to say anything more about the treatment, Jorgen, in regards to drug and alcohol?
No, I'm not really sure that I can add to that, actually. But I think it's interesting that suicide is so complex, in particular when we talk about murder, suicides, and the different types of suicide. Perhaps it might not even make sense about talking about one sort of course of suicide, and it's much more complex than we actually imagine sometimes.
And I think as well, to add to that, is its complexity means as well that you need to, particularly when suicide is very present, we need to follow the evidence that suicide-specific treatment is absolutely the primary focus. So we don't address eating disorders, drug and alcohol, and other potential mental illnesses or issues when someone is actively suicidal.
Just deal with that behaviour.
We deal with the behaviour, and sometimes concurrently we bring in opportunities and address other issues. But yes.
Well, I think we need to move ahead, because we want to deal with the second myth, because we're close to our time. So the fact that talking about suicide can cause suicide, what do we actually know about that?
I love this myth. And look, we absolutely know, if we just ask those with lived experience in particular, but we have emerging studies as well that show that there are not negative or harmful effects from asking about suicide. In fact, in my clinical 20 odd years working with people who are suicidal or their families, the relief that comes with having being able to disclose and talk about an experience provides so many inroads for being able to seek help and opportunities for us to respond. And of course, it's the way in which that is done, safely, appropriately, and compassionately.
In the context of support.
Yeah, absolutely.
But at the same time, we then have guidelines which tell us not to talk about suicide. We talk about mind frame and things like that. How do you reconcile that, to go and say to people, talk about suicide, ask about suicide, but don't talk about suicide?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. So our media guidelines in Australia, which are leading the world, in fact, are based on good evidence that we have, that talking about suicide on large scale levels with people, not one-on-one, in ways that sensationalise, glorify the act, talking about details of method, and a whole range of other unsafe or potentially harmful ways can be harmful. We don't have the opportunity to support the vulnerable people out in the populations where we're conveying our messages.
So those guidelines are really important for being able to guide us, because emerging evidence as well is showing that, on the other hand, when you give positive stories, you focus on help seeking, and you focus on problem solving and trying to destigmatize that, and literacy, mental health literacy, and these types of foci bring about a more positive outcome in suicide outcomes.
So it's sort of a risk, because when we start talking about it, can almost be the done thing or something that we don't want to normalise. We do want, I think it's Thomas Joe wanted to talk about, we do want to have a certain amount of fear of it, but we also want to talk about it where we can actually connect around it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in a way that doesn't overly normalise it, but really allows people to talk, quite honestly and get help.
And that's sort of a dilemma, because quite often when we're going for a resource, and we all have to paint the pictures of being the worst in order to get our funding, in terms of getting our articles published and all those kind of things, and yet perhaps that's not actually the best thing to do.
Well, there's different audiences, of course, and I think being able to highlight what is critical is that we do have one of the worst of all human tragedies to deal with, and I think it's important that we identify the tragedy and the leading cause of death in younger people. We need to be able to demonstrate how important it is, therefore, that we need to address the health issue. And so we can't avoid that, but it's the way in which that's written about. It's the way in which we talk about need to focus on protective factors, and what are we going to do to address the problem. So trying to be solution focused around this problem. A lot more that can be said, of course, about it, but
absolutely.
Can I ask you a question? I know we have to wrap up.
Yes.
What are your takeaway tips for our listeners? Because we've covered a couple of myths that are extremely complex, and I have no doubt that people in the audience will be stimulating their own answers to some of these as well, that are probably.
But I think that's one of the things that is really important to me, and it's perhaps one of the things that came out in your presentation earlier when you said that the master's project and the program was going to be multidisciplinary, putting all the different things together. That is that suicide is an understandable but complex phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's if we take the time to actually understand from a number of different angles, it's actually quite an understandable situation.
Sure.
But it's more than one thing.
Yes.
And the other thing is often from a lived experience point of view about this idea of actually being asked and talk openly about suicide. Once we start openly about, once we actually start connecting with people, it's sort of almost a ton of bricks off your shoulders, and you can start breathing up, and it's
So that's a point of action for people if they are themselves feeling in that space. And I thank you for sharing your story, because that brings me to my takeaway tip, actually, and that is that we need to continue to listen and get better at listening to the expert in front of us at an individual level, and ask them what is contributing to them being suicidal.
Yes.
And we need to understand better what keeps them alive. And to do that, we have to be honest and transparent in our discussions with each other. And we need to try to be more educated around issues so that we're not carrying myths to guide our responses. We're relying more on the expertise, the lived experience and science to do that. So, I'm sure that there's many other tips that we can provide as takeaways here, but I know that we have to wrap up. So
I think we should.
Thank you for your wonderful interviewing of your past lecturer.
Thank you too.
Excellent.
And a thank you to all our speakers today for their presentations. We've only been able to scratch the surface of this topic. There's far more material available on the AISRAP website and through the publications. I'd encourage you to reach out to us. We're more than happy to respond to questions which you might have. If we can't help, we might be able to put you in touch with people who can. I think I'm going to leave with Jorgen's response here that suicide is understandable but complex, and that's certainly what we're trying to do. Thank you.